Network is absolutely free.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Today, for our third segment, we are going to be discussing some injuries, as always, and their ensuing fantasy implications. Now, this week, in terms of the injury crisis that has seemingly befallen the NFL, there are very important ones. And for better or for worse, they can highly affect how you view not just players in your fantasy football squad, but how the team as a whole is affected by it. Because these injuries are very prevalent in how they'll show up on the field for these teams. The absences of these guys, so to speak, are going to show up very much so for a lot of these teams, whether they're a playoff contender or not. And most of them aren't at this point. But at the end of the day, these injuries can actually shape our kind of fantasy minds because of how kind of difficult they could be to navigate. If we don't necessarily find a solution, it's not going to, sustain our fantasy football squad. We always have to be forward thinking about injuries. Yes, we hope that these players have a speedy recovery, but we also feel like, as fantasy football managers, we also have to take advantage of certain situations. So this is a very interesting, very kind of complex segment that I feel like I want to present to you more often, and I want to keep you updated on injuries of this kind of status and how prevalent they've become, especially. So without further ado, let us jump into our injury segment of the day, starting off with one that's slowly developing into a very worrisome situation because this team is not in a good place, perhaps the worst in the entire NFL right now, in terms of play on the field and in terms of situation. I feel like this injury is a stark reminder of what can happen when you're kind of backed into a corner in the NFL. So let's talk about Chris Olave here. And the news about Chris Olave should worry a lot of people because Chris Olave was seen as someone who could potentially be a trade asset in that trade deadline. Because of these injuries, because of the ensuing nature of them, this is fifth concussion throughout his career. I feel like, a team like the Saints are bound to pay for these mistakes. They're bound to and kind of obligated to kind of cover up their tracks, so to speak, in certain situations. They can't get out of certain players. They can't get out of, the dead cap hits they're going to have to face in the future. But they also can't escape the fact that if this team is what it is right now, then what's to say Chris Olave coming back is going to necessarily be a good thing? I don't necessarily see how Chris Olave is suddenly and magically going to transform this team into a contender again, because that's where the Saints are. This is not by any means a team that's going to contend in the next 5 years, perhaps the next decade. And it sucks because Chris Olave was seen as a hopeful piece of the puzzle for the Saints. And now, with all the injury woes that have befallen him and the questions concerning his future, it's going to be a difficult uphill battle for the Saints to overcome with all the questions that are going to be asked about Chris Olave in their future. But in terms of a positive update on how things are going, he met with specialists yesterday. There was no decisions about whether or not to put him on the IR, but for what it's worth, potentially the firing of Dennis Allen kind of, alleviates some of the pressure on the Saints to release information about Chris Olave. So that's the only real thing the Saints should be happy about, is that their firing of Dennis Allen overshadowed this information. But it is a very concerning thing and a stark reminder of how, this injury information can be so integral to specific teams around the league, especially teams much like the Saints who are foundering near the bottom of the league. But we do wish the speediest of recoveries to Chris Olave because he's a very talented player when he's on the field, and it just sucks that he's in a situation like this on a team that doesn't necessarily have any answers for him. So I just wanted to remind you of that. And this one, from a fantasy perspective, is also pretty dire because the Saints really aren't a team that have much excitement to them in terms of the players on their roster, maybe outside of Alvin Kamara. But other than that, we wish Chris Olave a speedy recovery, and I do hope that the Saints can recover from this, but it's going to be a steep mountain to climb for them. Now let's talk about a very bizarre injury that occurred. Drake London, after catching a touchdown, appeared to injure his hip, had a headstand celebration that's been going viral, and then immediately went off the field with that hip injury. He was limited in practice this week, was day-to-day, but in terms of the fantasy implications of this injury, if it is more serious than the Falcons expect, I feel like, Drake London is the thing that makes this Falcons offense tick. He is perhaps the only reason why I have any optimism about what the Falcons offense doing. And people are saying, well, the defense's fault that the Falcons are losing game, and they are often right. The defense for the Falcons has not been living up to par, but the offense, you kind of bound yourselves to Kirk Cousins. And Kirk Cousins is not someone you want to bind yourself to for the near future. He's not someone who I would have confidence in if you're the Falcons and are planning to make deep playoff runs in the future to get you that far, or potentially win you a Super Bowl. He's just not. But I feel like when Drake London is playing at the level he's been playing at this season, that's when the Falcons are at their best, no matter who's at the quarterback position. Because he's become one of the more talented receivers in this core, has the most mature receiver in this skill position group for them. Most importantly, he's willing to kind of account for and compensate for the struggles that Kirk Cousins is facing, because Kirk Cousins is strictly someone who's not going to create out of structure. So as a receiver, that just makes your life that much more difficult because you're always having to find ways to get open. And Drake London has been doing that to a T. So if this injury is more serious than expected, I don't necessarily see the Falcons' offense being one that's appealing to me from a fantasy perspective. And for what it's worth, I feel like they're slowly as a team losing their luster. Even though they're going to make the playoffs, they have that tiebreaker over the Bucs. In fact, won both of their games over them, so they're not worried that much about that aspect of the NFC South race. But when they get to the playoffs, it's going to become drastically clear that this team, and especially this offense, is simply not prepared. And it's going to stem down to Kirk Cousins. It's going to stem down to the failure to get these receivers to play at a top level outside of Drake London. But I have optimism that this injury is not as serious as I initially expected, and so I do hope that Drake London does come back, because the Falcons kind of do need him at this point, so to speak. Now let's talk about perhaps the worst injury of the week, perhaps the one most detrimental to fantasy prospects, Dak Prescott. Now actually, I wouldn't necessarily say this is detrimental, but it is kind of selfish a little bit to say that I actually have a little bit more hope for the Cowboys offense, because not to say that Dak was entirely holding them back, but I feel like the burden that Dak had on his shoulders in that situation forced him to kind of push too hard. And I'm not saying this caused the injury, and funnily enough, that's not necessarily what the broadcast was worried about. In fact, the broadcast seemingly did not expect to hear Dak Prescott had a hamstring injury. I believe the initial injury that people were concerned about was a laceration on his hand. So this one kind of shocked a lot of people from how low-key it seemed. But I do want to point out that the Cowboys are in a very weird place right now, because I feel that what's holding the Cowboys back is just letting loose, and I know that Dak Prescott is capable of that when healthy. However, for this season, I kind of feel like Cooper Rush coming in is an opportunity to really let loose, because now the kind of cat's out of the bag, so to speak. Now you know the season was a little bit of a waste, and potentially are worried about how this will play out with Dak and CeeDee's relationship, because they are now tied to this team for the next 5 years or so. So this feels like it's a wasted season. But I kind of feel like by replacing, not necessarily replacing it for good reasons, obviously, but replacing Dak Prescott with Cooper Rush, in my mind, kind of frees everybody's mind from the pressures of delivering for Dak and CeeDee, and for Dak and CeeDee to deliver for the Cowboys, if you catch my drift here. But it still is a very concerning injury, because we know that Dak is not playing up to par, but we know that for the next 5 years or so, that's not always going to be the case. We know how talented he is, and we've seen glimpses of what this offense can be with him. But this year just felt so weird and so kind of off for the Cowboys, is the right word, I believe, for the situation. But I feel like, this is also a not necessarily positive situation, but a situation where you have the weight off your shoulders of expectation, and you can just play freely a little bit. Not to say, again, that Dak Prescott was holding this team back. It just felt wrong from the start this season. It kind of started happy with Dak signing, the extension, CeeDee as well, but it never really coalesced, because I don't believe the Cowboys are at a place where their identity is set. So that's why I feel like this injury, for better or for worse, changes how I view this team going forward, and how the trajectory for them changes as well. Now let's talk about the last injury here, perhaps the least significant injury, but also an injury that a lot of fantasy football managers might not even be really hurt by, but I do want to mention it for what it's worth. The Xavier Legette injury. He did return after injuring his hand. I believe he left early in the second quarter, if I'm not mistaken. Played after the injury. But this is an interesting one as well, because if this is a lingering injury, then I feel like the Panthers had to start, asking questions about the conditions of some of these players. Because remember, Jonathan Brooks is still out, and you now are down Jonathan Mingo, even though we don't know what he would have contributed this season, because he did not get off to the best of starts for them. However, the Xavier Legette injury, like I said, is not one that I would completely panic about, because A, the Panthers are going to be bad anyways, and B, he did play through the injury as well. I just wanted to mention it as an injury that could be interesting to monitor if it's a lingering, like I said, thing. And also because, the Panthers have had some injury woes this season. Adam Thielen had the hamstring injury. We talk about Brooks a lot on this show. But I feel like, questions are going to have to be asked about the Panthers' injury crisis. And also how, if these players are healthy, how to get them to play better. Because that's the point as well. Because Xavier Legette, out of all these players who have been injured for the Panthers, has the most hope out of all of them, ironically. So that's why I wanted to mention this. Because of Xavier Legette's stock rising in the fantasy world, so to speak. And the last one that I don't have a picture for is the CeeDee Lamb injury, obviously. But I feel like, this week-to-week injury for CeeDee Lamb. Again, kind of weird that both of them are injured now. But, like I said, pressure off their shoulders. But that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, I make my picks for the week in the biggest games of the NFL weekend. You definitely don't want to miss it. We'll be right back after this short break.